Sewing the very first straight seam will mark the beginning of everything in the dressmaking process. If you can align seam edges together with right sides touching, notches matching, and you can follow the seam allowance correctly during the machine stitching process, you can pretty much say you know how to sew. Everything you need to know to learn how to make your own clothing starts with sewing that very first simple straight seam. But to sew this seam, there's still some rules you'll need to follow. Learning how to sew begins with sewing a simple straight seam. While this is truly the simplest task in dressmaking and a great way to get started, there are some basic rules that should be followed in the process. Before you begin, make sure all your notches and other sewing notations are transferred from the patterns to your fabric pieces. It is also important to distinguish between the fabric's right and wrong side, as this will be imperative in the seam alignment process. It is a good idea to also transfer all seam lines from your patterns to your fabric pieces. The marked seam lines provide a stitching line as well as help you identify the proper seam allowance without having to go back to your sewing patterns for reference. You will need a set of ball head pins, a good pair of scissors, and of course your sewing machine. First, find the matching seam edges based on notches and other markings. These should have been transferred at the pattern marking stage. Place fabric pieces on top of each other such that the face sides are touching and the notches are perfectly aligned. To hold the two fabric layers in place, insert pins horizontally, perpendicular to the edge with the pin needle point facing inward as shown. If your fabric is structured and easy to handle, you may insert as many pins as you feel will be enough to keep the edges properly aligned. In case of slippery, difficult to handle fabrics, insert the pins more densely for increased control. If you already feel very comfortable with your sewing machine, you may stitch the seam using pins as the only stabilizing technique. Make sure to remove the pins as you approach them and never stitch directly through pins. The horizontal alignment of the pins with the ball point facing outward will make the process of removing them very safe and easy in the machine stitching process. In case you are not altogether comfortable machine stitching a seam held together only by pins, apply a hand basting stitch prior to machine stitching. Doing so will keep the fabric layers securely aligned and easy to handle. Apply the hand basting stitch right next to the seam line. As you baste the seam edges, remove each pin as you approach it. The goal is to replace the pins with the hand basting. To machine stitch the straight seam, place the two fabric layers under the presser foot and drop the needle in at about 1/2 inch away from the seam's top edge. This will allow you enough length for backstitching. Using the backstitching feature on your sewing machine, stitch backwards to the top edge of the seam, then forward to stitch the rest of the seam. As you stitch, follow the marked seam line carefully and make sure the fabric edges are continuously aligning with the appropriate seam allowance guide on your machine. Stitch right next to the basting and not directly through it. Doing so will help you remove the basting thread much faster. When arriving at the bottom of the seam, backstitch at ½ inch backwards and then again forward to secure the stitching. Iron the seam in the direction it was stitched first. Next, open the seam and with the wrong side facing up, iron the seam allowance open. Not all seam allowance is ironed open. This should only be done if no other technique is specified. Depending on the project, seam allowance can be pressed to a single side or enclosed in a self-bound finish before being ironed. As a last step, press the seam one more time from the face side. Make sure to use a protective cloth for heat-sensitive fabrics. If unsure of your fabric's heat setting requirements, always test a scrap before proceeding.